Hello everyone and welcome to another video here in this channel. Today I'm gonna show you how to turn this thing right here into this thing right here. That's right, we're gonna be painting metals with a hand-painted approach here inside of 3D Code, and I'm gonna be showing you some important theory points as well as the techniques and the steps to get to this result right here. If you want to follow along, make sure to go down here. It's available on the free resources inside of the new course. Just click on the free preview, download this file, follow along, and create something amazing. Let's go. Now, before we jump into the hand-painted process, we do need to study a little bit the material and understand how it works. So the interesting thing about metals is that they will always reflect the environment that they're in. This means that if we change the environment, the way the metal looks will also change. For instance, if I go for this soft studio right here, you're gonna see that it looks very flat. Like the gold doesn't look as shiny as what we normally get with these very bright metals, right? And that's because the light that we're using in this one is a very diffuse light. If we go for something that's a little bit sharper, like this one right here, Studio White Umbrella, you're gonna see that the shine also starts reacting in a slightly different way, right? We see something that looks a lot sharper here on the top part of our element. Now I want to show you one of the secrets that I learned about metals that really made me understand the whole thing. And that's the fact that the shine that we see, the reflection of the light that we see, will always be dependent on the angle that we're viewing the object at. So right now, since we're seeing this helmet pretty much straight on, we can see that the shine is right there on the center of the object. Look at how it shines right here on the edge of this trim. Well, if I rotate my view, I'm not rotating the light, I'm rotating the view, the shine travels with that rotation. Of course, it doesn't travel completely with my line of sight, right? We're still seeing it at sort of like a glancing angle, but it rotates around and we're going to be seeing different type of reflections depending on where we're actually seeing the element. This is super important because with hand-painted stuff, since we're baking this information down, we need to decide where the light is coming from. We want a 3/4 view of light, or if we want a top-down light, or we want a bottom version of the light. Like, it really doesn't matter, but we need to pick a direction, and once we stick with that direction, we need to try to sort of like wrap our heads around how this thing would look without actually moving the camera around. Because if I move the camera around, yes, of course it's going to be looking very different on this side, but it doesn't match with the reflection that we have here on the front view. This is where the construction of value comes into play, and that's what we're going to be doing next. So we're here inside of 3D Code, and we're going to do a very basic value construction. I'm going to start with number 2, and I'm going to go edit, calculate occlusion, and in this particular case, I am going to change this to a hemisphere. I'm going to make sure that it's a hemisphere so that we get the sort of like shadows coming from the bottom part. I'm going to hit OK. What this will do is it will make a basic ambient occlusion map. We can also do this inside of Substance 3D Painter. It's just the basic ambient occlusion map. Once we have this, we do need to change this to multiply because by default, it's set to occlusion and it won't be showing here on our basic layer. Now, as you can see, now we have volume. We can appreciate what's going on. We see the shadow here on the underside of the helmet. So this is what we want, but that doesn't mean that we're exactly there. So I'm going to add a new layer here on top. I'm going to grab a soft brush. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to start incorporating a little bit more shadow and a little bit more contrast in some of these areas. So to do that, I'm going to press S to go into symmetry mode. Make sure enable symmetry is turned on and press symmetry on X. There we go. You can also press S and not show the symmetry plane. That way it's a little bit easier to visualize. Now I'm going to sample one of this sort of like darker colors right here. I'm just going to start incorporating it on the areas where I would expect there to be, you know, a little bit more shadow. Now there's something interesting that's going to happen with metals, and that's the fact that metals will reflect the environment. We already talked about that, right? So we're not going to have super strong shadows like on this area right here. This surface should bounce a little bit of like color back into this area, but I'm still going to construct the basic of my layer right here with just some extra shadow, especially here on the top where I felt like we were missing just a little bit more. Now this one I'm gonna set to something like a multiply so that it darkens the whole thing, and I'm gonna soften it up right there. You can see we get some like interesting errors right there. The cool thing about the hand painted process, and I'm gonna do this in a different layer, is that since all of this is flat information, we can just go to a flat element here and just paint that out. Those are probably either UV bake issues or some like some baker issues or something. I'm going to lower the intensity of this one even more because I do want to have a little bit of opacity, but not too much. The next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a basic sort of like color for our whole thing. And right now I definitely feel like it's too intense. So I'm going to go to my fill tool over here, grab a little bit of a darker value, just fill the whole layer. And then with this one, I'm just going to play with the opacity. That way we can start with a lower element. If you feel like you're getting too many layers, one of the things that you can do is simplify. So for instance, if I go here to layer 4, I'm going to right click and I'm going to select this option that says apply layer blending. And now all of them are set to standard blend. And I can just right click and merge down. Or we could just go right click and merge visible. And now all of the layers are merged into a single element, and it's going to be a little bit easier to work with. Now, before we move any further, I want to give a huge shout out to Jekaterina Burkina, amazing artist, because she is the one that shared this particular process right here, which is going to be very easy to follow in order for us to get the effect that we want. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to add a new layer. This is going to be our color layer, and here we're going to select the specific color that we want our element to have. So we're going to go for something like this orangey, warmish gold. I don't want to make it gold, probably more like a bronze or something like that. Let's go for something, there we go. And we're going to fill the whole layer. This one we're going to set to overlay. And as you can see, it's going to give us a very nice base for the whole thing. If your color is too saturated or you want to play a little bit with some of the values, you can just modify this color. Remember, we can go to textures, adjust, hue and saturation. I'm going to lower the saturation and the lightness a bit. You can set a preview right there until we find the specific color that we want to go for. Something like that works perfectly great. Now, I'm going to add a new layer, and the new layer that I'm going to be adding is going to start defining where my main planes are going to be. I personally like using the square brush. I feel like it gives me, a little bit more texture, and it reminds me a lot of my favorite brush inside of ZBrush, which is the clay buildup. So I'm going to go to brushes. I'm going to grab my square brush right here. We still have symmetry turned on, and here is where we need to plan where our light is going to be coming from. So I'm going to go to pure white right here, and I'm going to start drawing some of the elements where I imagine the light to be. So I think the main highlight is going to be right there, and then we're going to have a little bit of a fade. Of course, depending on what kind of shape you're shading, right? For instance, this is pretty much like a sphere, then the shadow or the shine should be moving in that sort of like direction. This one right here, which feels a little bit more like a plane, it's probably going to be a little bit more like this. This part right here, the top element, is probably going to be a little bit more like a gradient, right? Going to the back. And then, for instance, we have the little trim right here, which should also be receiving a little bit of light. A couple more sort of like spheres. Okay, I'm going to press W to see the angles. And we're going to have a little bit of information right there, right there, right there. Some more spheres right here. So all of the faces, pretty much all of the faces that are facing up, right, that are facing towards the direction of our light, we would expect to see this sort of like behavior going on. And this is what I was mentioning before when we were inside of Substance. There might be some situation where it's a little bit tricky to figure out, like, where should I add a little bit of light or not? And this is where you can take some artistic decisions, because who isn't saying that we have another light coming from a slightly different direction that's incorporating or adding a little bit of value, for instance, on this area. So I'm going to add a little bit of value there, a little bit of value there, maybe even a little bit of value on this sort of like round shapes right there. Careful with not contaminating other areas. If that happens, don't worry, just go to eraser, and we can erase all of that information. One of the secrets to metals, or one of the important things about metals, is that there is going to be quite a bit of contrast. So you're going to have really high highlights and really dark shadows. Again, it depends on the metal, right? But in this case, we're going to go for something like that. Gonna add a little bit of shine right there on that board there. Maybe even a little bit right here. You can be a little bit aggressive on this stage. I tend to work very sort of like dirty at first, and then I start polishing. So for instance, here, I want to do a little bit of that right there, and maybe a little bit of that. So depending on where we expect the highlight to be hitting, we might expect a little bit of a shine going through the whole thing. There we go. So this is a trick. We set this layer to overlay as well. Why overlay? Why is overlay so important? Because overlay will take the values of the layers, right? In this case, it's a very bright value, and it will add it, right? It will multiply it with the values underneath, and it will also take the colors into consideration. So it will take the color that we had on the underlying layer, and it will bring it up in terms of values. And as you can see, we get this very sort of like interesting effect here on our helmet. Now, I'm going to start with a little bit of polishing on this process right here, and everyone has their own method. In my opinion, one of the things that I like to do is I right-click this thing, and I like to apply the layer blending so that this is now a layer, and I can sample the colors directly and just start blending. Because otherwise, if you sample the color, since it was set to overlay, you might be getting some like weird effects. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to sample all of these colors, and it already gives me a really nice sort of like clean guide of where I need these things to be affecting. Planes are very important, my friends. Very important. So in this particular case here, I do want to have a very clean plane where we have the division between these very bright colors here on the top and the light colors on the sides. Planes and shapes are one of the things that are going to define the volumes in our elements, and they're important to make sure that they look nice. Now, I've shown this trick before. We can break the plane a little bit. So for instance, if we grab a little bit of a darker value right here, we can start carving into this element and give the illusion or the impression that there's a little bit of a hit or something going on and that we don't have a perfect edge. But that should always be a decision that you make on your own. You should never let just like mistakes carry those decisions. Now, for instance, this plane right here on the top is very similar in direction, so it's gonna probably be catching a little bit more light. So I'm gonna modify the view right there, and I am gonna give it a little bit more of a light color. We can always paint some information right here, so like darken some of the elements and get a little bit more of an interesting look. Again, it's very important. Turn on, you can press W to turn on wireframe and see what's going on here with the metals. One of the things that I love about hand painting stuff is that it definitely feels very similar to sculpting. Like when you're going through this, as long as you understand the importance of light and how it sort of like rolls around the different elements, then it definitely feels very similar to sculpting. So I'm gonna add a little bit more light, as you can see, going in this direction. So I'm gonna increase the sort of like the highlight of the element for now. I would expect there to be a little bit of highlight on this area as well, to be honest. And I'm going to keep the dark shadow areas on this side of the helmet. If you want, you can make this asymmetrical, but in this particular case, I don't really recommend. Now, I'm going to move a little bit ahead of things, and I'm going to explain a little bit of the reflection, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit difficult to understand what's going on here. But I would expect there to be a little bit of a reflection on this area right here, because it's reflecting this like bright section. I'm just going to add a little bit of the reflection right there on that part of the helmet. Keep blending the colors, just sampling and blending. Get a basic construction. I'm going to do something similar here. We might expect to see, you know, a little bit of a bounce light. So the light hits this area and then boom, bounces back into this little section right there. On this area, I do want to give it a little bit more, you know, highlight to this section right here, or like fade it a little bit more towards the bottom. So I'm adding a little bit more illumination. We call this the local color value, which is I want this local color value on this like part of the helmet to be a little bit brighter. I'm not too worried about all of this. All of this is pretty much going to be shadows at the end, so quickly fill that in. Later on, we can also give them a little bit more texture to it. But there we go. Now, it looks very flat, very matte right now. So what is going to be the secret to really push this to the next level in terms of like the polish? Well, if we go back to substance, you're going to see that the main difference right here is that the highlight is very bright compared to the other situations of our element. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to grab white again, and I'm going to start using my brush, a smaller brush. I'm going to start placing my highlight. Okay, so I want the highlight to be on this area, ignoring or trying to avoid some of the outer edges of the element. If we set this again to overlay, we're going to start brightening up these elements. Remember, do not sample anything else, like keep it white, because if we sample anything else, it's just going to look very weird. Now this highlight needs to be stronger, needs to be a little bit bigger, so we're not gonna go as far as what we did on the previous one. We can always tone it down, we can always adjust it, we can even go and erase some of the elements, but this is the main highlight that's gonna start showing the type of material definition that we want. You definitely want to keep it a little bit smaller than what we had before. So if we had like, let's say 100% of this direction right here, this one's gonna be on a smaller area. You can also try using a soft brush. Soft brushes are really good for this sort of like initial construction of the values. And it helps with the smoothness of the blend as well. So as you can see, we're really pushing the effect right there. I do think it's a little bit too much, so I'm gonna sort of like lower it a little bit. And then we're gonna add the next layer, which is gonna be the really big layer, the layer that's really gonna push things into perspective. I'm gonna add a new layer here. I'm gonna grab again my white value, my white color. And this one's only gonna be the highest points, the hottest points of the metal. So for instance, right there. And we can set this to color dodge. Color dodge is such a powerful blending mode right here, because color dodge will also multiply the values, but it will also burn them. So you're gonna get this very, very intense or like highlight effect. Actually, I think that's a little bit too much. So I'm gonna go with like a smaller, very, very subtle glow right there, and set this to color dodge. And you can see how this really, really pushes things way, way too much. I'm exaggerating things over here, of course, because this is just like the basic construction that I want to show you. But it's very, very important to keep that into consideration when building our elements. Now, before we add those very, very bright highlights, I do want to go back here to this like stage, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time. This is another thing that I struggle sometimes to communicate here in these videos, but doing this kind of stuff definitely takes time. And it's not something that you can easily finish in just like a couple of minutes. So I'm going to be working, I'm going to show you here the time lapse of the process, a little bit of an element. I'm gonna of course talk through it, but yeah, this is the artistic process where we actually go in here and start adding all of the detail. Now, before we continue here with the time lapse, my friends, I do want to talk about something very important, and this again has to do with the value construction. We go over this quite a bit during the course, and that's the fact that we always need to think about where the faces are, well, facing, right? So for instance, we got these little cylinders right here, and if we think about the caps of the cylinders are not looking down, therefore they shouldn't look like this super dark squares, but they're also not looking up, and I wouldn't expect them to shine or have as much reflection as this faces right here. So we need to go for like a mid-tone value, and this is where I mentioned that planes are very important, because all of that area is going to be my mid-tone value area. See that? And then what we can do, if you want to add a little bit of, variation, is we can add a little bit of a gradient. So for instance here, we can add just a bit of shadow so that it looks like light is shining a little bit more on this upper part of this sort of like coin face, right? And it's not shining as much on the lower part. We have very, very little pixels right here. I'm working with a 2K map, so we're already losing a little bit of that information. But you can see it really can make this thing like quite special. Now, one thing I'm going to do here, for instance, and I know we're going to be doing this a little bit later, but I'm just going to go for a little bit of a higher value, and I'm going to hit just the corner or just the border of that thing right there. See that? So by doing that, by really having a difference in terms of values on that element, we're separating that particular edge from the remaining parts of the object. We can follow the exact same principles, for instance, on this guys right here. As you can see, these guys have a little bit of a bevel, so I would expect the upper part of the circle, this guys right here, to be catching a little bit more light. But as they go towards the upper parts, right, towards this areas right here, I would expect them to actually get the opposite, to get a little bit more of a darker shadow. And then we create a nice little gradient that goes from one point to the other. And look at how much more definition and detail we're getting on that stuff, because we're really telling, hey, light is bouncing on this particular corners. This is the attention to detail, and this is I personally love this part, by the way. Like, it's one of my favorite parts of the whole sort of like painting process, which is finding the puzzle and understanding where and why we need to be adding this like shadows and elements and breaking up the silhouette of the objects. But this right here is also one of the most time-consuming parts of the whole process, because it's going to take you quite a bit of time to make sure that you go into every single one of the circles, for instance, to really get that information that we need. But look at how much more different and more interesting those circles look now that we're able to find that particular result. But let's continue here with the time lapse. The main thing I'm doing here is I'm trying to make sure that the planes and the reflections are exactly where they need to be. Remember that we need to think about where is our strongest point, where is our mid value, and where are going to be our shadows. Once we have that, then I'm trying to reduce the glossiness of the whole thing by making the specular highlight a little bit smaller, okay? Now, once I have that, it's again making sure that the planes have the proper value and adding a little bit of detail to make sure that we can read the forms. This is a very important part right here. I like to make sure that I add a little bit of darkness to all of the borders to make sure that we get this sort of like ambient occlusion pass, so that we can really tell where the different volumes of our element are switching. Then, once we have that, it's a matter of just blending, cleaning up the edges, adding a little bit of texture. This is why I like working with the square brush, right? Because the square brush always leaves a little bit of hard edges across the whole thing. And it's like Bob Ross used to say, right? These are the happy little accidents that you can get to really get something that looks a lot more natural. So you can see me going and doing a little bit of like line art. It's not exactly line art work, but it's kind of like outlining the different elements and making sure that we have the values exactly where they're supposed to be. Once we have that, it's cleanup. Cleanup means making sure that you blend properly between the different colors, sample the one that's across it, go through it, clean up of the planes. As you can see right there, that little part needed a little bit more cleanup. I actually went into the 2D view and fixed that over there, and making sure that we have a nice blend, a nice gradient between all the different values that we have for our element. Once that was done, I just went ahead and again made sure that the glossiness was not too much. It's looking a little bit more flat, of course, but we're going to be working on the metal bits in just one more second. So that's pretty much it. Once we've gone through this, a little bit of shadow right there, a little bit of ambient occlusion again to give more contrast, then we're ready to go to the next stage, which is the metals. Let's go. Very well, my friends. So this is the result after roughly like 25 minutes of working on this thing, and you can see the big change, right? Like this was our initial sort of like blocking of the colors, and now we have something that looks way more polished. It still looks a little bit on the rough side, right? Like I think it definitely reads like metal, but it's still looking a little bit on the rough side. So now we can start adding some layers to really push this to the next level. I'm gonna go to my brushes. I'm gonna grab a soft roundish brush, something like this, and I'm gonna sample, remember, a white color for the first sort of like highlight passes. Actually, no, I'm gonna change this around. I'm gonna go with a round hard brush instead, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go for some really hot spots here. So for instance, here on the trim of the whole thing, I want to add a little bit of a line. There we go. And remember, this one, we're going to be setting to color dodge to really, really, really make this thing shine. And the reason why I'm going for this is I just want to hit the very, very, like the highest, I just want to hit the highest, most intense points of the element. Remember the little corner that we talked about on this little guy right here? It's just that. It's like the last little highlight right there. Imagine like this is the sun being reflected on the elements. That's the little thing that we're trying to catch right here. As you can see, I'm not using pure white on all of the areas. I'm sort of like playing around or dancing around with some of the values that we have a little bit more of an interesting effect. The stronger the highlight, so the smoother you make this, the sort of like smoother the whole thing is gonna look. It's gonna look a little bit rougher. If you keep it really, really sort of like contained, then this thing's gonna really, really start shining. But you gotta keep in mind the sort of like directionality of the light, right? So the highest, hottest point that we're gonna have is gonna be here on the very sort of like corner of the whole thing. And then we're gonna start losing things due to how light decays, and we're not gonna see it as much on some of these areas. For instance, here for the main highlight, I'm just gonna keep like a nice softish or like glow. This layer feels like magic to me because just by adding a little bit of detail, we can already get a very nice result. Here, for instance, I'm gonna change to the square brush because the sort of like strokes that we have right here like follow a more stroke-like effect. You can always, if you feel like this is way too much, you can always go a little bit lighter, and that's another way to sort of like control your strokes. And of course, the more times, or if you click on it a little bit more times, right? If you add a little bit more color, you're gonna start seeing a little bit more of this value, because since we're in the color dodge approach, we're gonna be adding this sort of like information. Here on that corner, little bounce light right here. Right, that's a good way to sort of like highlight some of the elements. Look at that, looks pretty cool. Keep in mind again that we can always go to eraser, and if we added a little bit more highlight that we want in certain areas, we could just take it back, or take it out. There we go. So I definitely think this is too glossy, but hopefully you guys get the idea. I mentioned that I wanted to show you how to make very glossy materials, or sort of like more matted materials. In this case, I want to go a little bit more matte, so I'm just going to lower the opacity a little bit. And that's kind of like removing the roughness, right? Like this is such a magical thing about how layers work and how values work. Because remember, and I always like to do this, I'm not sure why I didn't do this before. I'm going to create a new fill layer right here. I'm going to add a black layer and just fill everything. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to saturation. So now that gets rid of the saturation. So I want you to look at the following thing, guys. This layer right here, which is my color dodge layer, is pretty much like my roughness layer. I just painted the roughness highlight, or the specular highlight of my element, right? So if I lower this, it's pretty much like removing the roughness or increasing the roughness with a layer, with this paint layer that I'm doing. Of course, we need the previous value construction of all of the gradients and shapes and forms that we have on our element. But this layer right here plays a very important part in letting us know how shiny or not an object is. So in my case, I think I'm gonna leave it roughly right around there. So it does look like it's shining, but it's not like super intense. Now I'm gonna create a new layer, and now we can start adding some more like interesting variations to the whole thing. I already did a little bit of that. You might have seen it on the time-lapse where I added some like dents or things like this one right here. But let's imagine we want to add like a crack, right? So I'm gonna hit S to remove symmetry, and let's say we want to add like a cut right here. So the only thing you need to do is work with lights. I like to work with dark colors first, so I'm gonna map out where I want my element to be. So let's say right around there, and then I'm gonna use my eraser to sharpen that cut, so something like that. And you can imagine that if this thing is cut right there, then there's going to be some edges, some sort of borders that are going to be receiving a little bit more light, and some edges or borders that are going to be receiving or casting a little bit of a shadow. So if we already have the highlights, you don't have to be second guessing yourself. We just grab that big highlight right there, for instance. I'm going to go to this faces, just add the highlight right there. At this point, we can go back to eraser and again, clean up that border a bit more, right? And look at that. When seen from afar, it's going to look like a nice little cut that we have right there. Of course, I would expect there to be, you know, a little bit more change. So I'm going to start adding a little bit of a gradient right there. I might even go a little bit darker, kind of like painting the ambient occlusion here. We can play like with a little bit of the roughness of the edge, right? Like we don't want this cut to be super perfect. I do feel like the color is a little bit bright, so I'm just going to do this sort of like glazing technique where I grab a similar value and just go over it very lightly with my pen pressure. Make sure that we don't get any sort of like weird effect. There we go. And another thing we can do is we can go to this highlight or to this edge right here on the outside and also highlight it a little bit. Not too much though, just a little bit to really make it pop. Now, another very important thing about metals, and we mentioned this before, is that they tend to reflect the light into other areas. So I'm gonna add a new layer right here. I'm gonna go with a yellow color, something like this. We're gonna go with a soft brush, and what we can do is we can just add a little bit of sort of like bloom to the whole thing. So it looks fine, I think. I really like how this is looking so far, but we can definitely, again, sort of like push some of the values. So for instance, if I add a little bit of yellow right there, and a little bit of yellow on this border, which is reflecting the general element. Actually, let me go back to symmetry. There we go. A little bit right there. Remember we talked about a little bit of bounce light right on this area, maybe on that area right there. I would expect maybe a little bit of bounce light right there. Of course, a little bit of bounce right there. It's pretty much hitting some of the shadows, right? For instance, here, like I would expect to see a little bit of reflection of light right there on the border of our cap. And we set this to color dodge as well. And as you can see, that's gonna give me that very nice sort of like yellowish glow that just makes everything feel like it's part of the same environment, right? So I'm gonna go a little bit more right there. Go maybe a little bit on that border. You can go crazy with this one. I mean, if we just like fill everything with gold, right? With a very soft layer of this thing, you can add a little bit more saturation. So if you're feeling like you lost a little bit of saturation, this is a great way to add more color into your object. I don't think we really need it for ours right now, to be honest. But you can see the effect. Oh, super crazy. But now let's keep it down. So I'm just gonna add a little bit right there, a little bit right there. It's a great way to make sure that we're guiding our audience, right, our players, into the areas that we want them to look at. Delete all of the elements that we don't want. So for instance, these little guys right here, I would expect there to be a little bit of bounce light, of course, on the main highlight there. And now we lower this up. Right, like we never want to use like full layers. This is just a way to add a little bit of extra complexity to some of the areas in our object. Now, the final thing that we want to do, or one of the final things that we can do, is break up a little bit of the monotony that we have on the colors. So I'm gonna add a new layer. I'm gonna grab any of the colors that we have right here. Let's say this one right here. And then what I can do is I can shift the hue a little bit. So for instance, let's go a little bit more towards the green colors. You might be wondering, well, why green, right? Like green is a very weird color. Well, most of the materials in the real world, they always have a little bit of color variation here and there. And what I can do is I can just start injecting a little bit of that variation. So this could be some of the rust or some of the elements that we might see on this object. And right now, it looks very ugly. I'm going to show you a nice little technique that we can do here, which is just change the blending mode to color. And what that does is it injects the color and it keeps all of the values intact. So all of your highlights, all of your high points, they're still going to be there. If you try other things, so for instance, a multiply, right, that's going to darken the values. We can do color dodge again. It's going to make them very bright. We can do overlay. But as you can see, most of the time with those layers, we go back to the yellow colors. And if we want to keep a little bit of a different effect, we can go here to the color tab and then of course play a little bit with the opacity to make sure that it's not too obvious. I'm gonna remove symmetry at this point, and I'm just gonna start injecting a little bit of this variation in color in some of the areas of my element. When you're doing this, try to follow a certain logic, right? Like think of this like maybe it's dirt, or maybe it's like a little bit of a tarnish layer or something like that. Like it's just something that's gonna break up and change how we perceive some of the colors and the values on those particular layers. This is the time where you can really explore all of the different objects, all of the different options. Just go a little bit crazy with this effect. Look at that. Look at how it changes, for instance, the values that we see on this highlights right there. In a similar fashion, we can pick a different color. So instead of going towards the greens, let's go, for instance, towards the pinks, towards the reds. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a slightly different effect, right? Now, if you lower the saturation on these things, then the effect is going to be a little bit less intense. As you can see, it's sort of like more washed out. So it really depends on how you interact with different colors that we have right here. Definitely think that that one's a little bit too much. For instance, a little bit of that like effect right there can really add just that last little bit of like interesting information to our colors. This layer, this color break layer, along with the glow and the reflection, is really important to make sure that your element doesn't look boring, doesn't look very muddy, right? Like you probably have heard that term before, muddy. And that's when the colors are very close to each other. There's not a lot of variation, and therefore there's not a lot of like visual interest to the whole thing. Definitely feel like it's glowing a little bit too much here on the back. Like it's not bad, but it's definitely a little bit too much. So that sort of tells me that there's another light source over here. So I'm gonna go to this one, and I'm just gonna use my eraser. And with a soft eraser, I'm gonna tone that down a little bit right there. So that's it, my friends. As you can see, again, I've shown you this before. This is purely hand painted. There's absolutely no normal map information. There's absolutely no roughness information. Everything is hand painted, and this is one of my favorite styles in terms of 3D. I know in recent years it has gotten way more famous, but this style has been around for probably 25 years, right? Like all the way back to the beginning stages of like World of Warcraft. This was a style that was just quite a bit because of its optimization, right? We only use one map, and the artistic direction that we get from this is so cool. So hopefully you like this video. If you want, we do have a full course available where we explore all of these tools along with a bunch of other ones which you can use to make amazing characters. We make this very cool undead captain. Hopefully you guys have seen that one before. But yeah, this is going to be part of that course. I'm going to include this as a bonus lesson, and it was one of the questions that some of my students were asking. It's like, hey, could you show a little bit more about how to render metals? Well, here we have them. So that's pretty much it, my friends. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like, that helps the channel very much. Make sure to join our Discord, check out full premium courses, and I'll be seeing you back on the next one. Bye-bye.